So yeah, just to start, you see my name there. If you want to have a look at this on your phone, just Google my name, stefangigacz.com. I've put it on my personal website to make it easier for you and follow up later. I'm going to talk, as has been said a few times, about Peter Maurin and the movement he moved to after he left the Christian Brothers. And also I'm going to relate that to another movement which came out of the Sillon, the Young Christian Workers, La Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, and the Cardijn, Joseph Cardijn, a Belgian priest who started that movement. So yeah, I did mention earlier, just my own personal links with it from 1970 when my dad heard Dorothy Day speak in Melbourne, Australia. You can actually listen to that talk, it's online. I've got the link down the bottom. So that's a really interesting document where actually Dorothy talks about the Sillon also in her talk in Australia in 1970. I've put a picture there of my friend Kieran O'Reilly. Some of you here know him, I'm not sure in this group. Kieran, one of the great Catholic worker guys from Australia right up till today. Yeah, so but anyway, getting to the actual crux of the story, Peter Maurin and the Sillon. We don't seem to know a lot about what he actually did in the Sillon movement. If you know the book by Arthur Sheehan, Peter Maurin, Gay Believer, he does talk about it, but you kind of have the impression that that Arthur doesn't really know that much about what Peter did in the Sillon either. So his approach was to find out about as much as he could about the Sillon to sort of work out, well, what that meant for Peter. And in a sense, that's kind of what I'm doing in another way today based on my own research about the Sillon movement. And we know he joined just after he left the brothers around 1903, and it's said that he sold the Sillon paper, L'Éveil démocratique, which means actually the democratic awakening, which was really the big key idea of the Sillon, trying to build democracy in France at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. I don't know. I tried to get that face recognition software. I'm not sure if it's the same picture of Peter Maurin and this young guy who's on the presses of the L'Éveil démocratique there, but that's how they operated there, a kind of a cooperative thing which actually produced their first it was I think it was a weekly or a monthly paper, later became an incredible, actually, 1910 became a daily newspaper produced by this movement called Le Sillon. But as we've heard, over time, Peter somehow became disillusioned with the orientation that the Sillon took up. The accusation was that the Sillon had become too political, which I believe needs to be nuanced. We'll see about that a bit later. Yeah, the founder of this movement, actually I want to tell you about Paris. Who's been to Paris here? A few of you, great. Do you know Saint-Sulpice Church in Paris? Yes, that is where the Society of St. Vincent de Paul started in the 1830s. That area, a space of just a couple of kilometres around Saint-Sulpice, was a hotbed of Catholic social action throughout the 19th century. That is where a college called Stanislas College is located. Young Frederick Ozanam taught there. The director at the time was a theologian and philosopher called Alphonse Guattari. He was there just before the revolutions of 1848. Everything was burning almost literally in France across the 19th century. And so there was kind of the Catholics, the progressive Catholics were trying to find solutions. And much of it happened in this tiny little area. You can't believe how small it is. And even Gaudium et Spes, the great Vatican II document, it was written literally just on the edge of this square in 1965. So 150 years of social action in this incredibly small area, from Frederick Ozanam through the Sillon right up to Vatican II. And the key person in this story is this young guy, also from a rich family, Marc Sagnier. His father was a rich lawyer, but a disciple of another guy, an early 19th century sociologist called Frederick Leplay. I don't know if people here, he's sort of fallen out of favour with the sociologists, whether they're secular or Catholic, because he had sort of these kind of a little bit funny ideas. He wanted to restore kind of medieval society with the idea of the people on the top level of society it was literally called paternalistic, looking after the working class and the poor. And we'll see the relevance of that to this story in a few minutes. But anyway, young Mark, he went to this great college, a very elite college. James can tell you about it, Stanislas College in that 6th district. In today's terms, you'd call it, I think, a K-15 school, because he went there from the time of kindergarten right up to the 3 years of college. So it's a long time to go to the one school. And he eventually studied at the École Polytechnique, a great French sort of technical university, and died just 1 year after Peter, almost to the day, in May 1950. And it's Marc Sagnier who's the key person in the foundation of this movement called Le Sillon. Now, the interesting thing about Stanislas College was it also was a hotbed of social action at that time, from the time of Alphonse Guthrie and Frederick Ozanam. And it was different from, for example, the Catholic Institute in Paris, which still exists. The Catholic Institute became a very Thomistic sort of institute, whereas Stanislas College, even if it's university side, you could say in very almost simplistic terms, was a more Augustinian philosophical sort of school. So it's very different philosophically from the Catholic Institute, which was only just a few hundred metres away. It was operated at that time by priests and brothers called the Marianist brothers, very significant. You know the Marianists?
University of Dayton was a Marianist.
Yes, exactly. And one big thing about them was that they tried to have equality between priests and lay people, even in the 19th century, but the Vatican said no, you cannot, lay people and priests are not equal. And this is also relevant to the whole Sillon story as well. A famous teacher at Stanislas at that time, some who know philosophy, somebody mentioned Maurice Blondel this morning. People call Maurice Blondel the philosopher of Vatican II. He was teaching at Stanislas College at this time, 1893, when Marc Sagnier was there, and another guy called Leon Ollie Laprune, who we'll hear about. But you know, look at the spirit that Alphonse Guthrie brought into that school. Now, if you know about Vatican II, if you heard about synodality, what do? We read the signs of the times. Back in 1860, Alphonse Guthrie, this was the method he was teaching. We've got to read the signs of the times. We've got to look at the realities, we've got to reflect on them, and then we've got to take a resolution and do something. Now, did those three little expressions mean anything to you? Maybe if you're familiar with Catholic social teaching, the see and the judge and the act. This is what Alphonse Guthrie was teaching in the 1860s. And this became sort of the idea, they called it, he was, one of the things he was famous for was the inductive method. So Vatican II, we say the church adopted the inductive method. Well, you can trace it back to Alphonse Guthrie and also to that period at Stanislas College. Picked up by one of his disciples, also forgotten in France, just terrible really, Leon Ollie Laprune. Many things I could tell you about him, but he became actually the inspiration of the Sillon. And one of his famous phrases was, taken from Aristotle, was life is action. And then you've seen the last bit there. He sort of rephrased what Guthrie had said. Society is becoming democratic. Aristotle said, he tried to analyse what political leaders do. Political leaders, well, they look at what's happening around them, they make an intellectual judgment about that, and then they make a decision, like George W. Bush. I'm the decider. That's what politicians do. So this is Aristotle's analysis. Leon Ollie Laprune said, well, yeah, now we're getting democratic, so that means everybody's got to learn to look at what's happening around them, make a judgment about it, and make a resolution about what they're going to do. In other words, a participative kind of democracy. This was basically, in one paragraph, the philosophy that Leon Ollie Laprune taught, and which was taken up as the founding ideas of this movement called Le Sillon. Now, the other thing to remember in the 19th century, everybody's heard of Leon XIII and Rerum Novarum because there was a huge industrial problem, workers' poverty, and he emphasised the rights of workers and everything. In France, in the 1890s, it was 100 years after the revolution, and everybody was remembering the terror and everything like that. So Catholics, conservative Catholics, were saying, we want to go back and bring back another king, you know, royalty, the restoration of the kingdom. And Leon XIII in 1892, just 1 year after Rerum Novarum, wrote a letter to the French and he said, look guys, forget about this, get over it. You're living in a republic now, get involved in the republic, try and bring your Christianity into the republic and make France a kind of Christian republic. This is the idea of Leon XIII. Now, you know, probably today in high schools and young people read Laudato Si. So these students at Stanislas College, they're reading these two encyclicals and they try to do something about it. And they started a study circle in the basement of the school called La Crypte. And you know, they're very simple things they said. We've got to do something. And we were ardent Democrats. This also became a stick used against them because if you say democracy, somehow it's not political to say you're for the king, but somehow you say you're a Democrat, that's political because you've got to elect people. So this becomes problematic for them even from the start. But at the same time, as well as teaching people about democracy, they emphasise exactly in the Ozanam tradition. They went out to the youth clubs, they tried to get in touch with working class, initially boys who were working in the factories around Paris and all that kind of thing. And you know, as Marc Sagnier said, when life abounds, it has to overflow. So you can't just keep it to one group, you've got to get bigger. And so they started a magazine. Initially, it was kind of a Catholic social teaching, intellectual sort of a magazine, but pretty quickly they turned it into a tool, into an organising tool. And by 1899, as they all left their college and go out and do other things, they started launching more and more of these study circles around France. And the difference was, I mentioned before, the inductive method. It's not top-down teachers teaching Catholic social teaching or whatever. The students were the educators of themselves in the study circle. That was the principle. And so they became hotbeds. They described it themselves, hotbeds of life and action. By 1905, they were calling themselves a movement. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know, maybe other people have heard other things, it's the first Catholic sort of group that actually used the word movement to describe themselves. So by 1905, they were organised on a national level, holding national congresses, reaching right across the country, starting to get bishops upset because, you know, this is run by young people, lay people. And what does a bishop do? He's got all these young people, and Marc Sagnier's in Paris, and how does he control what those young people in his own diocese are doing? That's bad enough. But then there was young priests got involved and seminarians. And so these young seminarians and priests, the bishops felt that they were getting out of the control of the bishops. And slowly this became problems for the movement. But, you know, anyway, the basic principle, as I said, was education through action. As I said, again, see, judge and act. You can see 1899. This is exactly what Marc Sagnier says, you know. First we've got to know the state of the country, like Aristotle said. Then we've got to think about it and look for solutions. And finally, well, we've got to do something. So this is the principle. They never used the term see, judge, act. That came 25 years later with Cardijn and the Young Christian Workers. But actually, the method that they picked up was directly derived from what the Sillon was doing in this time. And it wasn't just a method of doing stuff. They said it themselves, it's a life. It was more than just doing political action or social action. It was their life mission. And yeah, if we had time to go into it, it was everything. You know, I mentioned before, see, this is perception, judge, intellect, act, will, that involve the whole of their body. The idea came from Plato via Alphonse Guattari. It's a holistic sort of thing, an integral sort of approach. Lots of things they got from Aristotle, which people don't realise because I also probably don't study Aristotle anymore. But anyway, this other key idea also that they wanted from a biblical sort of idea from the gospel. They used to read the gospels every week in their meetings. This is one of the big things which was quite in advance for that time of the movement as well. So they wanted to become the leaven, like it says in the gospel. They wanted to become the leaven in the masses, inside the working masses, the people, as the French like to say. And they developed a whole bunch of different things there to carry that out. It's really interesting to see how they did it. One thing that actually I noticed somebody said this morning about students and workers together, I think it was in the talk earlier this morning, they brought students and workers together. This was a big Sillon idea. Later people abandoned that idea because what happens when you bring students and workers together, the students dominate because they got the education. So this was changed later on, but initially when the Sillon started, that was the idea, which slowly inside the movement, it was starting to develop where they have more worker teams, rural teams, and women's teams as well. This was quite in advance also for that time that we had study circles for women. The big thing was this method, it had an objective, and they based their objective around their definition of democracy. So the objective, what democracy meant for them was not political democracy, getting the votes on Tuesday of November or whatever. It was, their definition was maximising in French the word is conscience, which in English means two words, conscience as in moral conscience, but also consciousness as in Marx, let's say, you know. So it was maximising people's consciousness and responsibility. Now, for example, the word responsibility, Peter Maurin all the time, you can sort of make a direct connection there. It's interesting, for example, you know, I personally traced it. I've nearly got the whole chain, but you can trace how that's come into the Vatican II documents. For example, in Gaudium and Spes, you'll see the word conscience 28 times, the word responsibility 30 times. I wanted to tell the John Paul II people, if you look at Karol Wojtyla's book about Vatican II, he organised it around three words: conscience or consciousness, responsibility and participation. You can almost trace this directly back to the Sillon via the specialised Catholic action movements which came after. I don't have time really to talk about, but there was a very interesting movement. As usual, the women get neglected, but there's great research to be done on the women's Sillon groups which started out themselves. It's kind of interesting too from the personalist point of view, because they criticised the guys saying, these guys is just about kind of sort of social action, whereas they wanted to be more involved in sort of personal formation. So there was kind of a difference between the two sides of the movement. But where the trouble really started was in 1907, around 1907, because everybody thought this was great. Actually, not everybody thought it was great, but many people thought it was great, including Protestants. They said, we want to do this too. So gradually the movement opened up to Protestants. And you can imagine the trouble that might have caused among Catholic circles in 1907. They even were moving into North Africa, Muslim. So all these questions, which had become a question on a much greater scale for us 100 years later, these questions started to be posed inside the movement. There was all this stuff happening in France at that time, political things going on with the church. They felt, well, we got to do something, so we act. This created a problem too, because as soon as you start doing something, this is political action. It wasn't party political action, but it was perceived to be political action. This is one of the things I don't know if it's interesting to discuss. We could discuss what Peter Maurin thought about it, you know. The accusation was that the movement had become political. I don't personally see it like that. I think what happened was they started cooperatives, right? We want to do economic action, we start cooperatives. We want to do something in the political field, well, we've got to sort of get somebody involved in Parliament. But their objective was not to take political power. It was, like for example, they tried to get Marc Sangnier elected to Parliament. The objective was to use the Parliament as a tool of education, just as the cooperatives were also tools of economic education. But this is a point of discussion as well. But as we know, Peter, for whatever reason, he couldn't quite agree with all of that and decided to leave. But anyway, there's lots of photos and stuff from the time. They used to sell that paper in the streets and organise teams and lots of different things. Now all this led to a huge backlash. And anybody familiar with the French elections recently? Everybody's afraid that the extreme right wing was going to take over. Well, this actually goes back 100 years. You can trace also the intellectual roots to a thing called the Action Française, which was an absolutely, basically a fascist thing. They were royalist, nationalist, racist, everything. And a lot of bishops agreed with them, and a lot of Catholics agreed with them too. And it's, frankly, this is something to discuss too, because I see a lot of parallels between what was happening then and what's happening in the Catholic Church in the USA right now. They organised themselves, these conservatives, these reactionaries, and they started to act against the Sillon. And they got support from the Vatican. Look what this guy says. It's kind of unbelievable what he said. He was one of the people that was very active in the condemnation of the modernism thing. And this guy, Monsignor Bernini, says, Marc Sangnier is like a kind of mollusk that needs to be crushed. Because if it's cut into pieces, each piece will act independently and multiply in a more unhealthy way. That's a guy from the Vatican saying that. It's unbelievable. But of course, they had the power. 2 years later, they kind of won. They got Pius X to write this letter. And the criticism, look at the criticism. The Sillon has no hierarchy, which it didn't like the Catholic worker. So if you read this letter, you're going to think, I think if you look at what the Catholic worker is, you're going to think, wow, this is a condemnation of the Catholic worker. The priest lowers his dignity. He's not elite standing on a pedestal. They saw the role of the priest as a collaborator, as a counsellor, as an advisor, as somebody who accompanies the people. Look at that thing, the breath of the revolution. But the big thing that was the bugbear was they escaped the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical authority, because Marc Sangnier was the national president, and what does some bishop in Rennes do? How can he control Marc Sangnier in Paris while he's in some little diocese back in Brittany or somewhere else? So this became the thing that they went to the Pope about, and of course the Pope backed the bishops, and they asked the Sillon leaders to resign, which they did. Marc Sangnier said himself that it was by a special grace, by virtue of Saint Therese of Lisieux, that he had the sort of grace to submit to that, or to accept that decision from the Pope. The Pius X, he actually they said in words that they wanted the Sillon to continue, but actually it all lost its dynamism. Most of these reactionary bishops, they weren't just opposed to it because they weren't in control of it. They were totally opposed to it, so they didn't do anything to try and revive it anyway. So the fact was that the Sillon sort of closed down in 1910. It's interesting what Peter Maurin says. Obviously he was out of it by then, probably in Canada, I guess. But he quotes this thing, I think from the 1930s, by this Belgian priest, who was analysing the letter of Pope Pius X, and his name is Jacques Leclerc. And yes, he recognised it as a Christian democratic movement, full of enthusiasm and generosity. Tick, that's true. But the critique that Jacques Leclerc says it lacked deep thought. This was one of the big criticisms of the Sillon. Oh, they were good. They had a good heart. They tried to do good, but they just kind of went a little bit astray in their ideas. But I tried to illustrate earlier where they got their ideas from. They had a deep classical education, these people. Leonard Laprune, Alphonse Gratry, all this kind of stuff. So they weren't ignorant about things. If you disagree with them, well, that's one thing. But they didn't lack deep thought. So I don't know what Peter thought about that, but he did quote Jacques Leclerc on this point. And it's, I think this also is not a really it's an out of place criticism that they only believed in democracy. Well, what else is there? Okay, were they going to restore a monarchy in France? I mean, it's just completely unrealistic to even think about it. And Pius Leon XIII had already agreed. So I mean, what does it mean to say that they didn't really discuss an alternative democracy? There was no alternative realistically in France to the democracy or the republic that they lived in. So it's kind of misplaced critiques as far as I'm concerned. And the last one, imprudence in thought and language. Well, I tell you, we're all going to get condemned for our imprudences, aren't we? If we've got no hope for any of us if we're going to get condemned for our imprudences. So, but it's interesting to see why did Peter write that? I don't know why he wrote that. I sort of suspect that a lot of people, a lot of the Zionists, I mean, if the Pope criticises you and you're a good Catholic, you're going to say, well, maybe I was wrong. So I sort of interpreted it a bit like that. This is what the Pope said, so I'm a good Catholic, well, I better sort of take into account what the Pope says. So I think actually it's true. A lot of the Zionists did take it seriously what the Pope said, and sometimes they admitted that they were wrong when actually they probably weren't wrong, Now, Marc Sangnier did incredible things afterwards, which I won't talk about today, especially peace actions after World War I and all that, fight against Nazism, or actually sort of fascism in the 1930s and all that kind of stuff. But we won't leave into all that. But it's interesting what John the 23rd was nuncio in France in 1950 when Marc Sangnier died. And he wrote this letter to Marc Sangnier's wife. And he talks about the power, because he heard in 1904, when Sangnier came to Rome, he was a young priest, in the picture there, he heard Marc Sangnier speak, and he says the powerful charisma of his words and all that, the noble and frank humility in accepting what Pius X had done, made for us the highest ascension. So, that's kind of a pretty diplomatic way of saying made for canonisation. So that's pretty much what St. John the 23rd, as he is now, thought about Marc Sangnier. Pretty good, really. And it's sort of interesting to compare what does Dorothy Day think about all this, because even though we see sort of Peter's a bit sort of 50-50 about it, actually Dorothy, what she says is very positive. This is what she said in Australia in 1970. The Sillon did what we were trying to do. So that's very interesting as well. And she actually also quoted that letter of John the 23rd as well. So this is kind of really interesting. I don't know if there's nuances between what Dorothy thought and what Peter thought, but it's interesting to see all that. But to me, this is very moving. This is a biography written by Madeleine Barthélemy Madol. She'd been one of the peace volunteers working with him in the 30s and all that. And she says, Marc Sangnier, as I knew him much later, behind his good humour and cheerfulness, despite the vitality of his creations, was secretly the man of the lightning-struck Sillon. Yeah, and that's why I think she chose this photo. To me, it's the 1,000-yard stare, I really think he never got over it, I'm sure. And that's what Madeleine Barthélemy Madol says too. But the interesting thing is the Sillon died, but it lived through Peter Maurin and the Catholic Worker and other movements that sprung up afterwards, including this movement called the Young Christian Workers, which is my personal background. I haven't got time, you tell me when I've got to stop. Joseph Cardijn started 2 years later in a parish. He wanted to start the Sillon in Belgium, but already the troubles were starting and the bishop was getting suspicious of him. And you know what bishops do? They send a young priest to teach Latin in a rural minor seminary, which is what happened to young Joseph Cardijn a year after he got ordained and finished in the seminary. As Cardijn said later, sort of indirectly, he said, well, that was providential because it sort of protected him from all that controversy that affected the Sillon in the last years. But what happened when he finally got his parish 5 years later, 1912, he got together with the people in Belgium who'd all learnt the Sillon techniques, including Fernand Tonnet, who lived just near Valenciennes at that time on the Belgian border, and they all knew this Sillon techniques. So it's very interesting who the people Cardijn chooses to work with. So you can see clearly what he was trying to do was just pick up what the Sillon had been doing on a more general level among students and workers, but made it for particular, focusing on young workers. Child workers we call them today because they're all like adolescent, teenage workers. And you can see many things in Cardijn: conscience and responsibility, democratic virtues. He's always picking up phrases that we can associate with the Sillon. He invited Marc Sangnier to Brussels 1921, explicitly claiming the heritage. You know, the birds of the sky carry off this seed and it's fertilised somewhere else. I mean, you can't really be more explicit than that. And so that's what the JOC, the Young Christian Workers Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, was based on. Kind of spiritually sort of significant, interesting. I don't know if Pope Pius XI knew what he was doing, but somehow they made Saint Therese of Lisieux the patron saint of the young Christian workers. So it's kind of interesting to see that link with Marc Sangnier, who claimed the grace of accepting the papal decision of Pius X. And you know, they got critiqued also because people knew in France, they knew this was the Sillon with another name. So the French JOC, when it started from 1927, was criticised for being the Sillon reborn. But you know, like it's interesting too, that letter, the date of Pius X's letter, 25th of August 1910. And what's the date that's taken even up to today as the foundation day of the Young Christian Workers? It's the 25th of August. And I remember talking to Cardijn's, the woman who worked with him for many years, Marguerite Fivet, and her brother actually was involved in this peace movement associated with Marc Sangnier, but she wasn't convinced of the influence of Marc Sangnier on Cardijn. And then I tell her about this 25th of August thing, and literally her eyes lit up, and she said, Cardijn était comme ça. Cardijn was like that, you know, he was big on sort of this kind of connection, making these kind of connections. So I'm convinced actually that this was a way of sort of claiming connection to the whole Sillon thing. And after Vatican II, like I mentioned, some of the things that have come into the Vatican II documents, the whole inductive approach, See Judge Act, conscience, responsibility. And so the people that were still alive, there weren't many. This guy, Ernest Pézet, I call him the last Sillonist, I don't know if he technically was, but he said, we knew we were right. We thought it would take 100 years to be recognised, but it only took 50. So that they were sort of felt vindicated by the Second Vatican Council. And anyway, just to finish, Marc Sangnier, just before his death actually, he had a gathering that they used to gather every year on the Feast of St. Mark, and one of their sort of catchphrases was, we're all Sillonists continuing the work. And as he said, just literally weeks before he died, the Sillon's work is not yet finished, but my talk is.
Thank you.
Yeah.